Welcome to the news today. Good evening. We are live from the Jaffa Port. It's Tuesday night and we begin with a high-profile visit to Israel. Ukrainian President Poroshenko arrived in Israel today to a red carpet ceremony that included a military honor guard and band. The visit risks aggravating Russia, which previously annexed Crimea and continues to back pro-Moscow separatists in the conflict in East Ukraine. Israel's relationship with Russia has gained new importance since the latter's intervention in Syria, where Jerusalem sometimes acts militarily. I-24 News defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari has more.
President Poroshenko, it's a pleasure to welcome you personally in Jerusalem.
The Israeli Prime Minister may have gotten Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's name wrong as he welcomed him on his first official visit to Israel, but it was still mostly smiles for the television cameras. Israel's ties with Ukraine have traditionally been warm. Trade between the two countries stands at $1.3 billion annually, and the visit was an opportunity to sign several bilateral agreements in the fields of science, culture, and transport. But there are also geopolitical interests involved.
We understand now how close is our connection with Israel.
Poroshenko, for his part, was eager to draw parallels between Israel's history and Ukraine's current struggles.
For our two countries and people, we stand on the similar path. Like Israelis for decades, Ukrainian people throughout the last 1.5 years bravely resist external aggression.
But is Israel as willing to accept the comparison? The Ukrainian embrace is one that could cause tensions for Israel, considering Kiev's current conflict with Moscow. The Kremlin released a statement saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin had also spoken with Netanyahu Tuesday over the phone, with the two agreeing to coordinate in the fight against terrorism in the Middle East. The relationship with Russia is a major strategic priority for the government in Jerusalem. Earlier this year, Israel agreed to block the sale of military drones to Ukraine in response to Russian pressure. Indeed, Moscow has significant leverage over Israel, especially in relation to Iran, which still awaits the delivery of the Russian S-300 missile defense system. As regards Syria, Russia has publicly stated it respects Israel's security interests there, and Jerusalem would like to keep it that way. Media reports have attributed a number of recent airstrikes in Syrian territory to Israel, despite the protection the Assad regime receives from the Russian military.
All of Russia's actions in the region have always been and will always be extremely responsible.
With so many complex interests at stake, it seems this particular friendship may only be able to go so far.
Yes, and before we delve into the story further, let's go now live to Jerusalem, where diplomatic correspondent for the news today, Eli Hochenberg, is standing by at the president's residence. Good evening, Eli.
Good evening, Ayman.
Well, Eli, let's begin with Poroshenko's statement. He said that Ukraine stands with the state of Israel. First, give us an update on how his comments are being received in the country today.
Well, usually when a head of state is saying that his country is standing with Israel, there's great excitement in Jerusalem. But in the case of Ukraine and Israel, maybe the bigger question is whether Jerusalem is standing with Kiev. Ukraine has been through a rough time in recent years, and Israel remained pretty much silent, even when Washington pressured Jerusalem to come out against the Russian aggression, namely over the Crimea dispute. Jerusalem chose to remain silent in order not to be on the bad side of the Russians. And it's not just the general will, I assume, of any country in this world to remain in good terms with Russia, but the growing influence of Moscow in the region, in the Middle East. And only tonight we hear a report of the Russian news agency that there was a phone call between the Israeli Premier Netanyahu and Russian President Putin to discuss further cooperation regarding the Syrian crisis. So again, the biggest question in the relations between Kiev and Jerusalem is not if Kiev is standing with Israel, but if Israel is standing with Kiev.
Yes, many big questions. Eli Hochenberg standing by for us in Jerusalem. Thank you very much at this point. I'm joined now in studio by Paula Sleer, Israel Bureau Chief for Russia Today. Good evening, Paula.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, we hear that President Putin may have spoken with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today. Does this have anything to do with Petro Poroshenko's visit to the country?
Well, let me preface my remarks by saying we are aware of the phone call, but we have no more information than your correspondent announced now, I don't think the Russians are particularly concerned about the state visit of Poroshenko to Israel. There are a few red lines that would make Russia concerned, and I'll mention them in a moment. But by and large, the Russians know that it would not be in Israel's best interest to really upset them and make promises or gestures to the Ukrainians that could in any way dampen or harm Russia's relations. Those red lines are, number one, the issue of Crimea. It might be possible that the Ukrainian president is going to ask Israel to recognize Crimea as part of Ukraine. When that issue was on the table, the Americans asked the Israelis to do this, and they remained neutral. So it doesn't seem likely that they're going to do it now, particularly when there is so much of a higher standing of Russia in the Middle East vis-a-vis Syria and Iran. The other red line for the Russians is the whole issue of the Ukrainian fight, the Ukrainian military's fight with the pro-Russian rebels in the east of the country. Now, about a year ago, there was a secret visit by Poroshenko to Israel, and that visit seems to have been about asking Israel to support the Ukrainians in their fight, and Israel remained neutral on that issue at that stage as well. So again, it begs the question, why would Israel change its standing now? Those really would be the main concerns that the Russians have, but because of the reasons I give, the Russians are not overly concerned that anything's going to change in Israel's position at the moment.
Well, Paula, you say that it would not be in Israel's best interest. Can you elaborate on why? What can we estimate might happen should the case be that Israel does recognize, we don't know if this will happen, but in case it does, how would Israel lose in this case?
I think if you just look at the last few months, the Russians are playing a much bigger game in the Middle East. Let's first look at Syria. We know that there is coordination between the Russians and the Israelis in case there is any kind of coalition in terms of their army or in terms of their navy. The Israelis are not going to want to upset that very delicate balance in any way. The Russians also have a lot of leverage over Iran. So ask the question, why would Israel want to upset Russia when Russia is playing such a close relationship with Iran that could ultimately hurt the Israelis? And so really the timing is important. The Russians are increasingly more important in this region. They're playing a bigger role and they have a lot of leverage. The Israelis potentially need the Russians more than the Russians need Israel in this part of the world.
Well, Paula, of course, Ukraine is a big part of this. I want to bring in a voice from Ukraine to our conversation. We're joined now by Oleg Rybachuk, former chief of staff to former Ukrainian President Yushchenko. Oleg, good evening. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening.
Oleg, first of all, before we delve into today's visit, can you give us an update on the situation in the east of the Ukraine at the moment?
Well, the latest news is that today in Minsk they agreed about complete ceasefire, and then that this promises a quiet New Year and Christmas possibility for the people living in the occupied territories. This is the latest news.
And Oleg, how much is today's visit of President Poroshenko a strategic move on Ukraine's part, especially in light of Israel's relations with Russia, as Paula mentioned?
Sorry, please, can you say it again?
Yes, of course. I'm asking how much is today's visit by President Poroshenko to Israel a strategic move on Ukraine's part?
Well, I would like to tell you that probably Israel is quite often mentioned in Ukrainian relatives because when we think about our future and when we plan our life, many people, many experts, many politicians are saying that we have to learn from Israel how you can survive in very aggressive environment and how you can fight very effectively terrorism when you have neighbors who are not wishing you well, so to say. Therefore, the timing of Poroshenko's visit to Israel probably is one of the best, and what we discuss in Ukraine is also potential which was not used to maximum in our bilateral relations, like free trade agreement, like number of corporations in science, in medicine, something where Israel is known in the world as one of the most developed countries.
And Oleg, while the conflict in East Ukraine is ongoing, what about foreign policy? How much is Ukraine concerned with Russia's growing influence in the region?
Well, we are at war with Russians. We are fully realizing that we have two major enemies. One is Russian aggression, another is corruption within Ukraine. And those are very dangerous for us. So the latest news on relations with Russia is that from January 1st, we are going to have, despite Russian attempt to block it, free trade agreement with the European Union. We hope to get the same free trade agreement with the Israelis, and we have to concentrate on fighting corruption, because otherwise we will not be able to build up the state which could survive with such a big and not friendly neighbor as Russia is. So there is no much illusion about any kind of amicable solutions or compromises. We clearly realize that we have to survive. In order to survive, we must reform, we must have strong army, and we must learn how to be effective in fighting corruption.
Yes, Oleg Rebachuk joining us from Kiev. Thank you very much for that. Paula, finally, I want to bring in the Syrian point. You visited Syria, of course, and now Jerusalem wants to coordinate militarily with Russia in its own actions in Syria. Is today's visit going to have any effect on a future cooperation of this kind?
I think the visit per se won't have any kind of effect. I think whether the Israelis come out with statements that anger the Russians will have an effect. Poroshenko is obviously playing a political game. If you look at some of the language he's using, he's saying that we are very similar to Israel. We're both fighting terrorism. Netanyahu and Rivlin have been careful not to walk into that potential minefield, because the Russians would be angered if the Israelis made the equation saying that the terrorism Israel faces is the same terrorism that the Ukrainian faces, which according to the Ukrainians are the pro-Russian rebels in the east of the country. So as long as there are no statements that really anger the Russians, as long as they don't come out crossing these red lines I mentioned vis-a-vis Crimea and supporting the Ukrainian army in the east of the country against these pro-Russian forces, I don't think there's going to be any change in Israeli-Russian relations, and there doesn't have to be any kind of change on the field.
Yes, so many threats to consider. Paula Sleer, thank you very much for helping us make sense of this political minefield. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.